published extensively in all the first-year musicological journals you can imagine, name it, and 4 books. At one point or another, many people in this room will have referred to the arts of the Prima Donna in the long 19th century. I certainly did. And then many others, another collection, edited collection with Montemora Marvin, Fashions and Legacies of 19th Century Italian Opera, and of course her 2 monographs, Gioacchino Rossini's The Barber of Seville for Oxford University Press and Changing the Score, Arias, Prima Donnas, and the Authority of Performance, again for Oxford University Press. She's actually currently working on her next book project, a biography of 19th century diva Pauline Viardot, who we all know really, really well and has been named during these 2 days so far. So she will, in fact, I guess her presentation is linked to this book project, because we will have a prima donna now in her hat of teacher, singing teacher, the prima donna S teacher, Pauline Viardot, and her students. Please give a warm welcome to Hilary now.
Thank you so much. I actually think that's the first time anybody's ever said that I don't need an introduction. So that's a big moment. Thank you so much for this invitation. Thanks to the program committee. I'm really honored and touched. It's a big deal to give a keynote, so I hope I do okay. I also want to say that this is, as Barbara mentioned, it's part of a larger project on Pauline Viardot. It's taking me forever to write this book. I think it was due to the publisher in 2018, which is a little bit of a while ago. And I was saying to somebody else that the Gioacchino Rossini book I actually wrote in 4 months. I just kind of wrote it. This one is different. The opposite end of the spectrum. But this is one part of it, and I'm excited to share it with you today. So, as the scholar of divas, Marianne Smart, has noted, the silence surrounding 19th century singers, especially following their retirements, can be deafening. Not only were many of their accomplishments quickly forgotten, but their voices faded into oblivion almost as quickly as they exited the stage for the final time. Active prior to the age of recording, one of the only ways that performers could ensure that their voices would continue to resonate was through their students. Pauline Viardot, one of the 19th century's most accomplished prima donnas, understood the imperative of cultivating a vocal legacy through pedagogy, building an extremely active studio from the year she retired from the operatic stage in 1863 up until the days before she died in 1910. That Viardot spent nearly 50 years devoting time, energy, and extreme care to the next generations of performers is widely acknowledged by her biographers. And yet, of all aspects of her multifaceted career, her pedagogical pursuits tend to get the shortest shrift. Let's take the example of April Fitzlyon's The Price of Genius, A Life of Pauline Viardot, published 60 years ago, but which remains one of the most comprehensive and sensitive accounts of Viardot's life to date, in my opinion. Fitzlyon summarizes Viardot's pedagogical pursuits with this. Pauline looked after her pupils' welfare as well as their musical education, saw to it that they were happy and well fed in the pensions which she found for them, invited them about once a week to dinner at her house, and generally watched over them with a benign but strict eye. Most of them had great affection for her, but affection which was certainly tempered with awe, respect, and even perhaps fear. They thought her rather peculiar, full of contradictions. In spite of her grace, she reminded them somewhat of a hussar. They were all the same impressed by her rather theatrical elegance and smartness, and by the large number of dresses which she possessed. Referring to the last session, actually, she was inclined to be very outspoken and could be scathing on occasions, but her pupils grew to appreciate her frankness, although they feared her tongue. Most of the time, she was even-tempered, amicable, gay, and friendly, but she could be a despot and rather frightening. There are a few other references to Viardot's teaching scattered throughout Fitzlyon's biography, but lacking is any real texture or detail on the matter of pedagogical pursuits. None of her other biographers is much more explicit, and all tend to describe her teaching efforts in gendered terms, as does Fitzlyon, emphasizing the personal rather than professional aspects of the lessons. Why might this be? I believe the main reason for the inattention to pedagogy is obvious. Teaching is not sexy and tends to fall low on the hierarchy of professions in our society. One is reminded of George Bernard Shaw's famous axiom, those who do, those who can't teach. Viardot was a doer in every sense of the term. Her operatic career was rooted in a popular fame that few have ever been able to achieve. She traveled throughout Europe to glamorous and sometimes not so glamorous locales at a time when doing so was unavailable to most. Wherever she was, she mingled with famous authors, composers, politicians, and machers. She had a 30-year-long, sometimes torrid, sometimes tepid affair with Russian author Ivan Turgenev, and other famous men such as Berlioz, Ari Scheffer, and Gounod fell madly in love with her. When researching and writing about Viardot, in other words, there are a lot of other far sexier things to focus on. Indeed, while she was still an active performer in the 1850s, she herself described teaching as a drag, writing this to a friend. "It's that I find nothing more boring in the world, and I always have something better to do." Given, however, that she spent nearly half of her life teaching, she clearly revised her thinking, and as such, it is well worth the effort to delve into this aspect of her career. But let me be clear, I am not embarking on this project out of a sense of duty. I am doing so because there is plenty of sexy in this side of her professional life. In this sketch of Viardot's pedagogical pursuits, I explore this diamond of her career through some of its many facets. Her family roots, eyewitness accounts of her studio, an overview of who she taught, when and how, and most importantly, Viardot's thoughts on teaching in her own words to her students. Any account of Viardot's teaching career must begin with her family, specifically that she was the daughter of Manuel Garcia Sr. and younger sister to Manuel Garcia Jr., both renowned pedagogues. The elder Garcia began his musical career as a tenor and secured his page in history as the first alma viva in Rossini's The Barber of Seville. A composer and entrepreneur, he was the first to bring a troupe to the United States, then to Mexico, to perform Italian opera in the original language. Following his travels abroad, he returned to France and attempted to resume his career on the Parisian stage, but his voice had faded to a shadow of what it had once been, and so he turned to teaching. His pupils included Adolphe Nourrit, Henriette Marie Lalande, as well as his three children, Pauline, Manuel, and Maria Malibran. Writing to the music historian Henri de Curzon in 1900, Viardot reminisced about the lessons her father taught and the role she played in assisting him. "I was a 10-year-old little girl at most when Adolphe Nourrit used to come to the house. For example, I often had the pleasure to accompany him at the piano. Among others, I remember having deciphered with him the first melodies by Schubert, which arrived in Paris, and it went very easily." While Nourrit was not a paying student of the 10-year-old Viardot, it is apparent that even as a young girl, she had a talent for instruction and interpretation. She also absorbed an enormous amount from her father, as well as from his pupils during their lessons. Vocal pedagogy was part of her everyday routine. Viardot's older brother, Manuel Garcia Jr., followed a slightly different path than the rest of the family. Despite having studied singing and acting from a young age with his father, Manuel lacked stage presence and talent, and his attempt at a stage career ended with a thud in his 20s. Like his father, he turned to teaching, becoming one of the most impactful vocal pedagogues in history. His treatise, Observations on the Human Voice, published in 1855, became the foundation of all subsequent investigations into the voice, and his invention of the laryngoscope brought him world fame. The laryngoscope, a tool that used two mirrors and the sun as a light source, allowed Garcia and others to observe the function of the glottic apparatus and the uppermost portion of the trachea. The slide here displays the original laryngoscope, an image sent to me by Garcia's great-great-great-granddaughter of Manuel I. So she emailed me out of the blue and she said, "Do you want to buy this?" And I was like, no. What would I do with that? So she was like, fine. And now it hangs in a reconstruction of her villa in Bougival. Which is a much better place than like my closet, I think. Anyone with a passing acquaintance of the history of vocal pedagogy understands the centrality that Garcia has played. In his study of bel canto singing, James Stark summarized his overall impact. If there was a single point in music history when the tradition and science of singing met, it was in the life and work of Manuel Garcia II. Garcia was one of those seminal historical figures whose career marked a watershed between the past and the future. An heir of the old Italian school of singing, at the same time he belonged to a generation of scientific minds who wished to look beyond the mere appearance of things to their underlying ideas. Some of Garcia's accomplishments are broadcast on his gravestone, which I just love. You can't read it, but it says, the renowned 19th century vocal instructor was teacher and friend of Jenny Lind, Sir Charles Santley, and Matilda Marchesi, herself the teacher of Melba, and many other great opera singers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, bringing Garcia's method through the gramophone down to our and future ages. That is a gravestone inscription. The notion of legacy carved into stone on Garcia's grave is infused throughout Viardot's work with her students as well. I'd like to begin this overview of Viardot's own pedagogical pursuits by setting the scene of where her lessons occurred, the majority in her home studio. My interlocutor in this endeavor is the author of this quote on the slide, Emma de Bidoli, who summarized her teacher in slightly hagiographic terms. In Viardot's presence, one felt the divine spark, and every lesson was an event. Like the majority of truly great personalities, she had a keen sense of humor and a magnetic life energy. De Bidoli was an Austrian-born mezzo-soprano who studied with Viardot in Paris for 4 years between 1902 and 1905, after which she enjoyed a moderately successful career in various European centers, primarily as a concert performer. She moved to the United States in 1921 to teach Viardot's method in Cleveland and eventually became a theosophist, believing in Richard Wagner's mystical influence, among other interesting theories. In 1946, she published Reminiscences of a Teacher, an idiosyncratic memoir summarizing her early struggles as a poor artist seeking a vocal education, her fortune at being accepted as one of Viardot's students when Viardot was 83 years old, and her dedication to vocal education and the Viardot method thereafter. De Bidoli's book is particularly valuable, in my opinion, for her textured narrative of the space where Viardot held her lessons. It is worthwhile quoting her at length because her account provides readers the opportunity to drop physically into the room where these lessons occurred. She begins with the housekeeper tending to the salon in preparation for Viardot's arrival, describing what she witnessed almost as a sacred ritual. As a sort of prelude to my lesson, I would watch with interest the precise and methodical services of her maid, the opening of the Pleyel grand piano, the placing of a little standing clock to the left side, together with Madame's characteristic red leather notebook for her appointments, and on the right-hand side, the lovely oriental lacquer bowl. Into this bowl, each pupil dropped his tuition fee, 30 francs in gold for a half-hour lesson. At the end of a day's teaching, there was quite a heap of gold in the bowl. In wintertime, the thoughtful little maid threw a beautifully embroidered shawl over the back of the piano chair and placed a so-called chaufferette, a basin of glowing charcoals, on the floor near the piano pedals to keep the feet of her beloved mistress warm. At the stroke of 10, Madame appeared. Following this evocative account of the sights and smells of the salon, de Bidouilly turns to the lessons, noting that while Viardot arrived with a smile on her face, she immediately became grave and very strict. She continues. It was very hard to satisfy her ears, which were very keen for her advanced age. Though the pupil were standing far away from the piano, she could detect the slightest mistake. If my breathing became incorrect or sloppy once in a while, she always caught me in the act. She never used an accompanist, and although her eyes were failing, she played the hardest and most difficult accompaniments herself. Correction after correction was the experience of all her pupils. Sometimes I would apologize after the lesson for my mistakes. Though during a lesson, Madame Viardot might call me a few names, such as Becasse, equivalent to the German Dummigance or dumbbell in English, she was always very sweet when she noticed my despairing attitude. Then she would say, "Well, well, my dear child, if you did not make any mistakes, you would not have to take lessons." Discernible in this account is a slight echo of the approach Viardot's father took with some of his students, casting insults and even going so far as inflicting physical abuse on his two elder children, Malibran and Garcia, when they did not perform well. Viardot, who did not receive the same brutal treatment at his hand, vehemently denied rumors of his behavior. In a letter to Henri de Curzon, for example, she wrote, "My father was shamefully slandered as a father and as a man. How many times did I hear my sister say, if my father hadn't been so strict with me, I would never have done anything good. I was lazy and indocile. As for me, I didn't even see my father get impatient with me, and he taught me solfège, music, and singing." The story of Garcia's treatment of his two older children is complicated, a topic I recently tackled in an article published in the Journal of Musicology. Suffice it to say here that Viardot was spared the worst of his behaviors, but having adopted many of his methods, she was not above mild cruelty toward her students from time to time. Now that we have a sense of the space where Viardot's lessons took place and the mood during these lessons, the next question is, who were her students? To approach this question, one must appeal to a series of lists, the first of which is pictured on the next slide. If you've heard me talk about Viardot before, you've seen this. I trot it out every time I talk about her because it's such a fascinating thing. It's an inventory that Viardot took in old age of her friends, family, and professional acquaintances, everyone of note who she could remember having known throughout her long career. There are around 310 names on this list that includes artists, singers, composers, literary figures, politicians, and many others. A visual evocation of Viardot's famous centrality among a distinguished circle of great men and women. It's a little bit like Facebook before Facebook. Among the singers listed here are a handful of Viardot's predecessors and contemporaries, including Norrie, Schroeder-Devrient, Rubini, Tamburini, Persiani, Lablanche, Mario, Sontag, Lind, Pasta, and Grisi. As far as I can tell, only one of her own students makes this list, Désirée Artaud, on whom I will have more to say below. Fortunately, several other records exist where traces of her students can be located. Among the most official are the accounts kept by the Paris Conservatoire, where Viardot was appointed professor of singing in October 1871. She taught there successfully for 4 years, but in 1875 she resigned for reasons I'll discuss a bit later in this talk. As one would expect, the Conservatoire kept careful track of teachers and pupils, records that are preserved in the Archives de Paris. On this slide, we see two representative lists. The one on the the left showing the faculty of voice teachers in a given year, in this case 1871 to 1872. The second, a list of Viardot's students and auditors. From these records, we find that she instructed between 7 and 12 students per year at the Conservatoire, some of whom went on to great successes. In the pictured list, for example, we find Bilbao Vachelet, who's second on the list. Vachelet had a career at the Opéra Comique, and Marthe Duvivier, who's third from the bottom, reputedly Massenet's favorite singer and a leading artist at the Théâtre de la Monnaie in Brussels in the early 1880s. A few other notable students joined Viardot's studio at the Conservatoire in subsequent years. Blanche Tucker from Chicago, who appeared in Paris and London at Covent Garden, for example, and Caroline Chmerowski, who, after studying with Viardot for 1 year at the Conservatoire, came to international attention at Trieste and was successively taken up by London, St. Petersburg, Paris, and by several German and Italian opera houses. Overall, however, the bulk of her students, including those who attained the greatest fame, emerged from her private salons, whether she was residing in Baden-Baden, Paris, or London. Identifying the full slate of Viardot's private studio is difficult, however, since she did not keep an official tally of her students, or at least not one that seems to have survived. That red book that de Bidouly refers to is nowhere to be found, at least that I can tell. Fortunately, I have been given access to a remarkable set of documents assembled by the scholar Patrick Waddington, which go a long way toward helping reconstruct her pedagogical rosters, among other aspects of her career. Waddington became interested in Viardot by way of his work as a scholar of Ivan Turgenev, and he is author of a set of the most accurate and detailed articles about Viardot, her career, and her relationship that have been published to date. His work is rooted in meticulous archival detective work, and his process over the past 60 plus years has involved assembling huge Microsoft Word files on various Viardot-related topics, two of which are of relevance for this project. The first and most significant is a 2,300-page manuscript containing transcriptions of hundreds of letters that Viardot wrote to friends, colleagues, and family members over the course of her life. The document runs close to 1 million words and counting. In part, I'm so terrified it's going to crash. I do have it saved in various places, but it's like so big. So it comes close to 1 million words and counting, in part because for the past 10 years, I have been adding to it, working with a translator, Maurice Bonbon, on English translations of all the letters. Maurice always wants me to talk about him a little bit in these talks, but I say, I don't have time, Maurice. But he and I meet, or have met weekly, and have developed this kind of repartee and voice of Viardot, and we kind of bicker sometimes about what she means, and it's just been a lot of fun. The document is heavy with fascinating letters to some of her students, many of which I'll quote below. The second Waddington document is called Viardot's Pupils, and consists of what Waddington describes as jottings. Essentially, anytime he came across a reference to a student, whether in press reports, concert programs, library lists, archives, or Viardot's correspondence, he added the name to his document, sometimes with descriptions of who they were. The end product is a list containing names of around 330 people, primarily women, who studied with Viardot, a fascinating mix of singing pupils proper, members of Viardot's family, and aristocrats and others to whom she occasionally gave lessons as a favor. The data provided in this document are raw. Nevertheless, it is possible to glean from them a fascinating bird's-eye view of who she taught, when, and why. Viardot accepted all voice types into her studio, from the lowest bass to the highest coloratura soprano, and as might be expected, there is an enormous variety of skills, dedication, and talent among her students. Aspiring musicians came from throughout Europe, hailing from Finland, Norway, Italy, Spain, Germany, and Russia, among other locales. Americans showed up as well. The soprano Lillian June Bailey, for instance, traveled from Columbus, Ohio in 1878 to work with Viardot. Bailey did quite well in her studies, making her debut in London 1 year later. Following her marriage to the baritone and conductor George Henschel in 1881, she enjoyed great success as a recitalist of art songs, often together with her husband, until her untimely death at the age of 41. George Meader of Minneapolis, Hattie Louise Sims of Denver, and Hope Glenn of Pittsburgh were among a handful of other Americans who crossed the ocean for the chance to study with Viardot. As is the case with these Americans, there is little to no information on most of the names that appear in Waddington's list, but there are a few important standouts. Some of her students engaged in signature achievements, as, for example, Achille Boucher, the first to introduce Gounod's songs to Parisian audiences. Others went on to lead truly fascinating lives, wholly worthy of their own biographical studies. The soprano Clara Cath Marival, for example, debuted in Liverpool in 1878 and London in 1880, and then toured England, Europe, and America with the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company. In 1889, she moved to Australia, where she first sang in Brisbane, and then formed an ill-fated company in Melbourne, specializing in comic opera. She died bankrupted by the venture a few years later in 1891. Among the most interesting of Viardot's students is another American, Pauline L'Allemande, born in 1856 in New York. L'Allemande studied locally and made her debut in Syracuse, and then traveled to Germany, where, from 1878 to 1885, she worked chiefly at Stuttgart, appearing as Zerlina, Violetta, and Carmen, among other leading roles. She studied with Viardot briefly in the summer and early fall of 1885 in Paris, and then returned to New York to sing opera in English, including The Taming of the Shrew by Hermann Goetz and Lakmé by Delibes, which she claimed to have studied with the composer himself. L'Allemande enjoyed huge successes in various centers, including San Francisco and Toronto, and she traveled back and forth to Europe for the next decade or so. Around the turn of the century, however, she began to show early signs of psychological instability. In 1904, she attempted to mount the 3-act fantastic opera, The Cap of Confucius, in Syracuse, New York, and elsewhere, but this effort bankrupted her and she suffered a breakdown. Waddington tells us that she later settled, quote, with her eccentric inventor's son at Black River Falls, Wisconsin, where she lived in penury and weirdness, and in 1920 was forced to spend time in the Mendota State Mental Hospital at Madison. Some elements from her troubled life would later feature in the opera Black River, A Wisconsin Idol, 1975, and the film Wisconsin Death Trip. You can watch Wisconsin Death Trip on YouTube, and it's weird. Like L'Allemande, a handful of prominent prima donnas came to Viardot for short periods of time for concentrated study of one or a handful of roles. Pauline Lucca, for instance, worked with Viardot in 1869 on 3 roles with a view toward performing them in Berlin. Several other singers came to Viardot to study her signature roles. Examples include Virginie Hassman and Renée Vidal, who came for Gluck's Orphée, hoping to generate the same sensation that Viardot had created when she revived the part in Paris to stunning acclaim in the 1860s. The students who maintained long-term relationships with Viardot as pupil, colleague, and friend, who achieved the greatest successes, were the mezzo-sopranos Desiree Artaud and Marianne Brandt. To our great fortune, Viardot carried on a lengthy, decades-long correspondence with both women. These letters, along with a handful of others, allow a fascinating glimpse into her relationship with her students, her advocacy for them, and her approach to pedagogy. Before turning to this correspondence, however, I need to touch on one of the most significant aspects of her career as a vocal pedagogue. In thinking deeply about singing and performance, Viardot produced two important publications, both of which retain relevancy to this day. The first is the École Classique de Chant, which she published in 1861, 2 years prior to her retirement. This volume is a collection of selected songs and arias that she had mastered as a singer, each of which she prefaced with comments on phrasing, accentuation, and interpretation. It is impossible to hear Viardot's voice, of course, but the descriptions she provides in the École Classique de Chant go a long way toward helping us understand how she approached some of the most canonic tunes in the repertory and what she might have sounded like. Even more important, in 1880 and 1882, Viardot published the 2 volumes of her signature pedagogical work, Une heure d'étude. This method, modeled in part on what she had learned from her father and her brother, represents the foundation of her teaching philosophy. While the 2 volumes of Une heure d'étude were published after she quit her position at the Paris Conservatoire, she had been employing the method for decades, and her commitment to it formed the basis of her public and indignant resignation from that institution. In a letter dated September 15, 1875, to the director of the Conservatoire, Ambroise Thomas, Viardot laid out 3 reasons for her resignation as professor of singing. The first was that she felt that her student, Valentine Belgirard, had been unfairly snubbed for an award that the Conservatoire had bestowed on an equally deserving pupil. She thought they should have split the prize. The second was a distaste for what she perceived as a general lack of instruction and techniques that singers required to take on heavy roles, as opposed to an overemphasis on light comic roles. And if not for the third reason, however, she implies she might have rescinded her resignation. This is what she wrote to Thomas. Throughout the entire course of a student's studies, she goes simultaneously through the hands and to the lessons of several professors. She moves from solfège to ensemble to singing classes, and then to opéra or opéra comique. Now, if there are a few voices who tolerate the forced fatigue of so many courses without danger, the professors cannot have the same method, nor the same taste, not the same goal. In the midst of this diversity of teaching, sometimes contradictory, the student does not know where to direct herself, cannot attach herself to any method, nor persevere toward a single goal. While Viardot's language here is vague, referring in general to any number of methods, it becomes clear at the conclusion of the letter that she believes her method to be the best and only way. As for me, I see only one way to approach teaching a student to become an artist. The same teacher must teach her everything, from the basic elements of singing to musical declamation, to the very roles for which her timbre, the range of her voice, and her personal abilities destined her. I therefore believe it preferable to make myself truly useful, as I have always done outside of the Conservatoire, to have my full and complete freedom to train artists who will receive uniform, successive, and holistic teaching from me alone. From this, we can see that Viardot took what we might describe as a Wagnerian approach to instruction, overseeing every aspect of her students' education, grounded in the methods spelled out in Une heure d'étude. This approach, of course, is not entirely unique. As Richard Truscott reminds us, quote, every voice teacher had his page, a set of studies or vocalises that imparted correct vowel placement and agility, leading to facility in gruppetti, roulades, trills, and the like, unquote. Nevertheless, while every teacher had his page, not all had the impact to build a long-term following. Viardot was one of the few. In a letter to one of her former students, written around 1900, Viardot proudly listed not only her students who became famous opera singers, but also those who had become teachers and who were carrying on the Viardot method, her élèves professeurs. I won't read this full list, but a quick glance illustrates not only the number of student teachers, but also their vast geographic reach. Indeed, by the turn of the century, these students were assuring that the Viardot method had grabbed a strong foothold on European and American vocal pedagogy. Viardot kept close track of many of them, as we find in her prolific correspondence. I opened this presentation by remarking on the lack of texture surrounding Viardot's teaching and students in biographical accounts of the diva. This absence is particularly perplexing given the abundance of detail that can be found in her correspondence, much of which has been easily accessible in libraries and archives for decades. What I'd like to do with the remainder of my time this afternoon is to present a somewhat breathless overview of various contours of Viardot's teaching, teaching that can tease from her letters to and about her students. What unfolds here is by no means complete or even scientifically composed. I'm taking a first stab at highlighting aspects of this part of her career that I find interesting and showcasing elements of her writing that tie together her diligence, advocacy, and humor, three characteristics that served her well throughout her life. Let's begin with one of the most predictable, the letter of recommendation. What will come as no surprise to any faculty member in this room, Viardot's correspondence is packed with recommendations and requests to those in positions of power to grant individual students opportunities to appear in operas, concerts, and private events. I'll take one example of a student benefiting from Viardot's advocacy, the American singer Lillian June Bailey, about whom I spoke briefly earlier. This is a letter that Viardot wrote to the conductor and instrumentalist W.H. Cousins, and it resulted in Bailey's London debut at a Philharmonic Society concert under his baton, a performance that set her directly on her path to success. I chose to highlight this letter here because the lighthearted approach Viardot takes is typical. Also typical is the underlying sense of pressure with which the letter is laced, an offer that Cousins would have felt it difficult to refuse even if he had been inclined to do so. Allow me to introduce to you Miss Lillian Bailey, a charming pupil of mine, a charming girl with a charming voice, with which she sings charmingly. Can I say more? Do hear her sing, and I am sure that you will produce her immediately at one of your beautiful concerts. She is sure to have great success. She sings classical music as well as modern. She wishes to sing in London during the season, and I can give her no better recommendation than to you. I shall be delighted to hear that she succeeds in London, as I think she deserves it. Thank you in advance. A second student, Agalai Organi, the subject of many letters of recommendation by Viardot, was the direct recipient of the type of advice that Viardot showered on many of her students, pragmatic guidance geared toward advancing one's career. In this letter from 1867, for example, Viardot offers to forward letters of recommendation to Rossini and Gounod in advance of Organi's arrival in Paris. She then continues. Your successes delight me. You're absolutely right to take all the engagements that they offer you. Little theaters, big theaters, tragic roles, comic roles, everything is good. Everything is good to eat, as the pig says. Everything shapes the artist, as I say. As this example indicates, Viardot's correspondence is packed with folksy suggestions to her students on how to conduct themselves and their careers. Indeed, there is so much packed into her letters that it's difficult to summarize in just a few minutes. So I thought one approach would be to offer a pair of tidbits that Viardot sent to one of her most successful students, Marianne Brandt, just to give a taste. Brandt is another fascinating figure, worthy of study herself. She attended the Vienna Conservatory from 1862 to 1865, and then made her operatic debut in 1866 as Rachel in À la vie la Juive. She was extremely self-critical and anxious to do well, so she took lessons from Viardot on vacation periods of 1869 and 1870. Viardot praised Brandt's exceptional range and the quality of her mezzo-soprano voice, and is reported as saying, quote, "I was myself capable of singing any role but those written for a light soprano. You, with your astonishing compass, have the same gift. Sing any music you like so long as you do not have to tire or force your voice," unquote. Viardot and Brandt remained faithful correspondents for decades, and the letters that the teacher penned to her pupil contain representative examples of her instructions to students on how to sing, dress, and comport oneself. In one fascinating letter, Viardot gives Brandt tips on her impending appearance as Ortrud in Wagner's Lohengrin on October 9, 1869. What Viardot says here indicates a belief that Wagner's music should be sung naturally rather than made subject to a heavy, heroic style. For this reason, Viardot was calling for lightness, almost akin to that of Rosina from The Barber of Seville. Work every morning on light exercises, very much as if you ought to sing the role of Rosine in the evening. That will prevent your voice from becoming heavy and hard. Yes, I will think about you on Saturday during Lohengrin. You can sing Ortrud with calm. The role fits you well. Bring out the singing phrases as much as possible. Don't be afraid to sing piano. Hold the tune. Here is what is important. Hold the tune, hold the tune. Viardot's parting guidance, a hypnotic mantra to hold the tune, conveys the sense that this direction was something the two discussed often in their lessons, and that Brandt would know precisely what her teacher was telling her to do, and more importantly, how to do it. Viardot's letters to Brandt are littered with advice on how she should present herself in particular roles. When Brandt was preparing to sing Clytemnestra in Gluck's Iphigenie in Aulide, Viardot got into the weeds about what Brandt should strive to look like, in addition sound like. I advise you to study antique Greek statues a lot for the poses and for the draperies. Don't forget that you must never lose your inner calm, even in the most violent moments. The long and well accentuated gestures, the tranquil eyes. Remember to study in front of the mirror, to take care with intonation and pronunciation, and to not force your voice. Don't make too many gestures. At the end of the letter, Viardot went so far as to draw a sketch of how Clytemnestra must look. So some pressure there. Just as Brandt was nervous and self-critical, so too were many of Viardot's other students, and it was to them that Viardot penned some of her most sensitive missives. Time after time, she seemed to want to come to the rescue, often writing at length to a student in need, as was the case in this letter to an unnamed singer who was clearly under serious stress. I'll quote this letter at length because I find it both moving and good advice. Why torment yourself in this way by imaginary griefs and disappointments that you make up yourself? It's very good to have a very elevated ideal, but you must not imagine yourself that you get there so easily and so fast. Oh no, you have to work, search, hustle, suffer even, to get slowly closer, from a distance first, then continue to work patiently and with courage until you realize that you are moving forward a little. Patience, courage, perseverance. You have to send nerves packing. When one works, if one is well absorbed in what must do, nerves get quiet, and shyness, which is deep down only disguised self-love, disappears with a little group of little voice tremblings and tears. Come on, my dear child, tell yourself once and for all that you will still have the right to make mistakes when you sing for some time. Pursue your little way patiently and joyfully. Yes, joyfully. Try also to master and annihilate the susceptibility that makes you see things in black, which only exists in your head. These are words that we can all take to heart in our professional pursuits. Tucked into many of Viardot's letters are clear signs of the pride she took in her students' successes, not only for their accomplishments, but also because she understood that their achievements enhanced her own power and impact as a pedagogue. A fascinating example of this attitude appears in a terse note that she wrote to Leopold Hügel in November 1882. Hügel was the music publisher and editor of Le Ménestrel, one of the most important music periodicals of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The catalysts for Viardot's letter were twofold. The first was an article that Hügel had published on October 29, 1882 in Le Ménestrel, in which he referred to Marianne Brandt as, quote, the great German lyric tragedian, unquote. This was evidently not sufficient for Viardot's pride. Meanwhile, in Le Ménestrel of a few weeks earlier, he reported that another of her students, Pauline Lucca, had been staying in Paris to prepare the role of the ambassador to be performed in Vienna. This notice neglected to mention that Lucca was in Paris to study the role with Viardot. Apparently, offended that neither of these articles had given her sufficient credit, Viardot wrote, Dear Monsieur Hügel, I would be obliged if you would be clear when the occasion arises that Mademoiselle Marianne Brandt, the great German lyric tragedian, is my student. Madame Lucca came to Paris expressly to work with me on the role of the ambassadrice. She will be adorable in it, as she is in Mignon and Le Domino Noir. 1,000 friendly greetings. Interestingly, Hügel held off from publicly responding, or from what I can tell, privately responding to Viardot's request for several weeks. But when he did so in Le Ménestrel of December 31st that year, it was a rather extraordinary New Year's gift, in which he evoked her fame as a singing teacher and named no fewer than 21 pupils, including the subjects of her present complaint. So again, no need to read this, but it was a little bit of him being like, you want it? You got it. As Viardot aged, she wrote more frequently of the joys of teaching, sharing its pleasures with her former students, many of whom were wrapping up their stage careers and beginning to build studios of their own. On September 21st, 1890, for example, she mused in a letter to Charlotte Velletin, when you have students, is that right? Nope. When you have students who are successful, that gives a lot of pleasure, doesn't it? And in July 1892, she wrote this to Marianne Brandt. Your letter gave me great pleasure. You are well and very happy in your new teaching career. I am delighted because you alone among my German students can give a little bit of your fire to young girls capable of getting excited. But one has to admit, those are very rare, right? Well, in any case, one always makes students feel good. Oh yes, it is very interesting to give lessons, and for some time the master learns with the students more than the students learn from them. This is zwischen uns. Teaching them well the manner to study by themselves, this is what is always difficult. And then those little miserable ones take a long time to realize their shortcomings in general. You will write to me how your students succeed in Mannheim. This letter swings somewhat wildly between a sense of loving teaching and deep ambivalence toward the profession and students, but underlying the message is a deep sense of commitment, both to her former student and to the idea that the work they did together will result in long-term impact. In lieu of ending with a grand summary, I want to close instead with one more letter, a sweet note that Viardot wrote to her granddaughter, Alice Paul Viardot, the daughter of Pauline's youngest child, Paul Viardot, who became one of the most successful violinists of his day. Alice would eventually come into her own with a rich contralto voice developed under the tutelage of Blanche Marchesi. She would become a very popular and successful public singer, especially in concerts and lecture recitals. But she was barely 10 years old when she received this letter from her grandmother, who couldn't resist her inner pedagogue. My dear little Alice, I am very happy to know you are very well and happy. I hope that you study the piano and are singing regularly. Breathe in through your nose with a closed mouth. 1 hour per day, 3 times a day. She's 10. Copy music and transcribe with care. All that will be very useful to you. I hug you tenderly, your grandmother. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much. I think the long applause said many words. This was a super fascinating journey into an unexplored aspect of Pauline Viardot artistry, because teaching is also an art. Yeah. And such a great complex figure with, from a very distinguished musical family. So a lot of weight to carry on her shoulder as well, right? Yeah. And I can only imagine, no, I can't even start imagining the amount of archival research that is going on there. And yeah, we really look forward to reading your next book. And before I keep going on questions, Manuela, I'm grabbing the...
Oh, sorry, I know. Only face this way.
Oh, is this on? Is this on? Yeah. Thank you so much, Hilary. I think of you as my Pauline Viardot. So, yeah.
Hold the tune.
So I have a question for you. We've heard about Sharon Marcus today a bit already, but what you were talking about in terms of her pupils performing her repertoire as kind of, associating with her. And I wondered, made me think of Sharon Marcus talks about this idea of like historical competition where later performers perform previous repertoire to kind of compete with their predecessors. And I was wondering with her pupils whether there's instances of them being considered as like competing with her or like outshining or outdoing her, or whether it's more that they're gaining recognition and association with her. So is it more, I don't know, in some cases, is it more imitative, or are they trying to kind of develop and extend what she was doing?
I don't think any of her students outshone her, at least consistently. And there was, so it was much more of a desire to just be associated with her, particularly when you're talking about her signature roles like Fides in Le Prophète or Orfeo. Lots and lots of people writing about this are making, and when I say people, I mean newspaper reviews, making the connection to Viardot. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes in not a good way. But yeah, it plays into that whole continuum of like, you can never be as good as the past. I think even if you are somebody's pupil, there's always the sense of the lost past, and Viardot becomes part of that lost past, especially again with respect to some of these roles and even with her students. Yeah, it's probably not a great answer.
Coming. Catherine and Elizabeth.
Thank you. That's great paper, Hilary. I'm fascinated by this trove of letters.
Oh, yes.
And rather intimidated by it, I mean, on your behalf. So are you going to try and read them all before you finish the book? I mean, how are you going to decide?
I've now read them. We've translated all of them. We finished about a year ago with it took 10 years. It was
believe it, yeah.
An hour a week. So actually, it started at like 2 hours a week, but I couldn't, it's hard. It's like I couldn't handle it. So I cut it back to 1 hour a week. But it was just like chip, chip, chip away. And then I'll say the letters are mostly in French.
That was my question, yeah.
But there's some in Italian, there's some in German, there's some in Russian. So, the Italian I can do, the Russian I can't do. the German I'll pretend I can do, but I can't do. And it's really it's like a rough pass, and every time I go back now to look, there's tweaks and changes and mistakes, because what Maurice and I do is we meet online, and we talk it through just kind of in real time, and I'm typing quickly, and that's the process that we used. I wanted, for me, it was really valuable to have somebody who, my French is fine, but it's not like Claire's French. So really important to have somebody there who's checking me at every step. And then also, like, as AI gets a little bit better, I'm also like throwing things in there in real time, and we're discussing that. So anyway, I don't know what to do, because the other thing that's really amazing about this document is that Waddington contextualized every single letter. And no plans on publishing it, and because how, it would be, 50 years ago we'd do 10 volumes, right? But
a documentary edition online.
Well, there's the Digital Humanities project, but that's also, I have met with the Digital Humanities folks at Northeastern, and they're excited about it, but it's huge, and it's also very complicated, because it's mostly not mine. It's Waddington. There's another Viardot scholar named Nicholas Ekelin, who is really closely connected to the project as well. And then there's I only named a couple of the interesting documents, but Waddington also has this 1,000-page chronology of Viardot's life, where it's like every day, and then linked there newspaper articles. So it's like an incredible potential project where you can have the letters and then link it to the chronology, which links you to all the articles and books, and it's really big. And I'm chairing my department right now. And I can't.
Been there, done that. Is he still alive, this guy Waddington?
I
do you think so?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. He's in New Zealand, so it's just hard to be in touch with him.
Yeah, that would be an amazing resource online, especially with an index affiliate connected to that.
Well, and there are people doing really brilliant digital humanities projects already on Viardot. There's a network of German scholars who have like an incredible websites.
I love that talk. That was fantastic. And I was particularly struck in the letters by the psychological insight that she has, the varied approaches to her teaching, which are fascinating, particularly in that day and age. I have 3 questions that are less psychologically related in terms of her teaching. Is hold the tune a reference to legato, or a reference to intonation, or a reference to psychologically remaining in the character?
I think yes and.
Okay.
She doesn't ever explain it in that letter, but I think it's a matter of all and.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is personal. Does she ever refer to recitative teaching or recitative technique in any of her writings that you know of?
That's a really good question. I'm not going to say no for sure. Nothing
pops.
Nothing pops up, but I don't want to say no for sure.
Okay, and my third question was, in terms of the difference of methodology that she had with her colleagues at the Paris Conservatory, do you delve in any technical way into what that might have been in terms of singing technique in late 19th century France?
Not yet. That is a part of the project that is yet to be done, but that is an important one. And then the other related and even more important aspect is like where are the connections and overlaps of her method with her father and her brother. And in fact, you read about people talking about the Garcia Viardot, or the Viardot Garcia method, right? Like with the hyphen in between. So they're that closely related. So where does Garcia end and Viardot begin?
But you're going to deal with that technically as well in
Maybe. I mean, the issue for me is that I'm not a singer. I mean, I sing beautifully in the shower, and the car. You know, I've never studied singing, and so I am not sure that I'm qualified to delve deeply into that aspect. That might be for somebody else to do better than I could.
Thank you.
We are over, but I will leave time for another question. Last.
Thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. I was wondering whether you came up with some more precise information about the interpretation of specific roles. So something more specific about roles that these students were preparing, so some more would have reconstruct.
At this point, no. I mean, there's still a lot more work to be done there. I have in other contexts gone into deep depth about Viardot's tackling of certain roles like Fides and Orfeo, and looking at, you know, what she puts in these method books and how she may have applied that to her own performance. But in terms of the students, so you know, you do get to a certain point where there's recordings available, like Marianne Brandt, there's recordings, and a few others. So there's some rich ground there to be covered, but that still remains to be done.
Well, thanks very much again for a fantastic keynote, and let's give a last round of applause. Off to lunch, we reconvene at 2:30. Thank you.